Thanks a lot, Andrew, for the introduction. And thanks all for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. So, as Andrew said, I'm Andy Volk. I'm the head of startup and developer ecosystem for Sub-Saharan Africa at Google. And my team supports developers and startups across Africa through a variety of scalable programs that we run. And I'm also one of the creators of the Africa Developer Ecosystem Report, which is why I'm here today. It's hard to believe, but this is actually the 10th anniversary of my work supporting developers and startups in Africa. And I think my first keynote was at Pivot East about 8 years ago. So it's been amazing to see how much things have changed since then, how much growth has happened in the ecosystem. And also a lot of the people that I've worked with across that time, seen so many people here today who've really been investing in the ecosystem long term and supporting it. Personally, I'm also an investor myself. I'm a limited partner investor on some African funds as well as an angel investor. And so I'm very much personally and professionally committed to the African developer and startup ecosystem and seeing its success. Now what we're going to talk about here is the Africa Developer Ecosystem Report and dive a little bit into why we're doing it, how it's relevant to you, and some of the recent insights from that report. And it's really it's a conclusion of some work that we've been doing for several years. We're constantly asking ourselves at Google, what else? What else can we be doing to support the growth of the ecosystem in Africa? And this is the result of one of those what else questions. So first off, why even have a keynote about developers? How is that relevant to each of you in the room today, whether you're an investor, founder, other ecosystem player? And it's really because what's measured matters. And you always are measuring what matters to you, whether you're a startup looking at your customer pipeline, customer funnel, and running analysis on that, running perhaps business OKRs to run your business. And one of those key factors is really developers. We're the raw fuel for startup growth and success. And a few years ago, we were taking a look at what was happening in the ecosystem, mapping the growth of of Africa's beginning of what's now, a very strong rise in Africa. And we saw multiple reports on Pan-African startup funding data with different lenses and viewpoints that was extremely helpful. But we couldn't find a single Pan-African developer report using one methodology to measure developers across the continent and really model what's happening there. And without that information, it's so hard to make great decisions. You need the data to be able to move the needle, and that was really important to us. So as a result, we started talking internally. We put together an internal partnership across many teams at Google who've been so supportive of this effort, as well as working with our partner Accenture on this report, who've been fantastic to work with, who really did a lot of the deep research and looking here that you'll see, doing a lot of the modeling behind the numbers you'll see here. And so all the data I'm going to share with you today is from that report that we put together. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. First of all, we started with the 2020 Developer Ecosystem Report. The first year of that, we built and launched the report. We published it with our friends over at the Next Billion Users team, who published it on their research portal. And we put it out there because this was data we wanted for Google. We certainly wanted to be able to kind of have this for ourselves, but we also wanted to publish it publicly and share this report with everyone else, so nobody else has to ask themselves how many developers there are, and hopefully start some effects that we can't even chart yet of what impact it has for people to be able to understand what the developer landscape is like. One immediate result of that 2020 report was, for the first time, you can just ask Google how many developers are there in Africa, and now you get a number back. That's a good baseline. But much more interesting was the fact that now people were starting to pick that up. And we're so thankful for all the news outlets who covered this and shared what was happening. People talking about whether it's the gender divide between software developers in Africa, growth on a country-by-country basis, or the need and a very close link between software developers and Africa's economic growth and the potential there to accelerate things. And so on Monday of this week, we just launched our first annual update to the report, the Dev Ecosystem 2021 report. And this is a result of about a year's worth of work, really researching, building, modeling, and expanding what we're doing. So we added, it's not just 2020, but updated for 2021. We rethought everything. We said, okay, we're going to add more countries first of all. And we're going to also pay more attention to expansion in Francophone and Lusophone countries, which we've been proud to add more coverage to in the report. Looking at the platforms developers choose, looking at the ongoing impact of continued shifts, such as the second year of the pandemic, as well as the strong rise in startup funding that we've seen over the past year. And so we wanted to incorporate all these factors together and put that and bring that forth in the report. But what I'm going to tell you today is really just a very short summary of a deep report. And there's a lot of nuance behind those numbers. So I encourage you afterwards, download the report, check it out, and see how it is relevant to you. And if you have a chance, tell me what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear it. We always love feedback at Google, and I'm no exception. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. But one example of the nuance is Accenture, when we were talking with them about how to categorize different countries, how to look at trends across country cohorts. They created a model of categorizing countries into 5 trajectories: maintaining, advancing, cultivating, emerging, and nascent. And so you look at different trends across those groups, and you'll see different factors in common that help you to model some of the ecosystem. So that's a note here, just that there's more nuance behind this. But what I want to do with you today is share 3 key insights from the report in this keynote. And the first of those insights is the growth of developer population and pay in 2021 with African developers. Overall, we saw the population increase nearly 4% in software developers across the continent, which brings us up to a total of 716,000. But it's not, it's obviously not uniform growth across the continent. Some countries growing faster than others. And one real notable moment in terms of number of developers added was Nigeria at 5,000 new developers added, according to Accenture's projections, which is over double the number of developers added in, say, South Africa or Kenya. So it's really interesting to see the rate of growth changing across different countries. And we'll talk more about the developer pipeline that drives that growth and some of the ways that there's room for policymakers and big tech companies, training programs to really move the needle there as people see the opportunity. One interesting thing that came out of this report when we looked at really the fantastic startup funding growth numbers in 2021 was, is there any correlation between startup growth and investment and developer growth? And interestingly enough, 81% of VC investments in Africa went into the top 4 countries for developers on the continent. And so that was really interesting to see. And again, lots of data here in the table. Please feel free to dive in and check it out, all in the larger report. Another takeaway that came out of this was that demand for African developers reaches new heights. Now that might seem somewhat obvious on its face, but there's actually some really interesting detail here. And I'll speak a little bit to that now. First of all, startups, and by that we mean companies with less than 20 people, hire over 1/2 of Africa's developer population today. And that's fantastic to see. Those emerging companies really engaging with a lot of developers. And also, when we talk about developers, there's you can think of 2 primary cohorts of developers, junior developers and senior developers. And junior developers are, when they're getting their start, these are people who've just learned how to code or kind of are very early in their careers, are getting their start through startups and in some cases through small micro SMBs getting started digitizing. And so they play this key role in helping get startups get going, but in turn the startups are helping the junior developers build and grow their careers. However, there's also another factor beyond local hiring, and that's this rapidly growing group of global employers who are now competing for African talent as well. And when I say rapidly growing, I think it always helps to put some numbers behind that. And what you see here is that the number of teams hiring remotely from global companies has increased over 5 times during COVID. And once the pandemic runs its course, we still believe, according to Accenture's projections, that will still stay at a very high 66% of engineering teams working remotely. And that means more competition for African developers. Already 38% of respondents in the surveys that Accenture ran said they were working for companies headquartered outside of Africa. That's a very large group of employers. And what that means is there's more competition for African talent, particularly at the senior level on the remote hiring. We also saw that that's driving salaries up. And that also points to the question of like, how do we ensure that this is sustainable? How do we ensure that Africa's ecosystem is going to be sustainable when it comes to the supply of developers, training, what platforms they're trained on, cost of talent, et cetera. And so one thing that's really helpful looking at that is the developer pipeline. And so developers aren't just like a pool of uniform developers that increases at a certain rate. It's just like startups. There's a seed phase, there's a Series A phase, it's a continued phase of growth. And one thing that Accenture picked up when we really looked at the funnel with them and analyzed what was happening here was that there's actually a net decrease early on in the pipeline. And a lot of that was due to COVID, but it's really important to keep an eye on the early stage. Just as it is if you want to have a robust portfolio of exits, you need to be paying attention to what's happening at the seed level and really making sure you have a strong seed pipeline. This pipeline of learners and junior developers is really critical, even if you're only interested in hiring senior developers down the road. It really all has to work together. It's a pipeline, and it's one that deserves a lot of attention and support at the various stages. Now, the third takeaway I want to share with you is around education and access driving growth, to my previous point on pipeline. Interestingly enough, so universities are still, nearly half of African developers are learning through universities and learning how to become software developers, but also over half of developers are learning to be developers through informal channels. And these are boot camps, coding schools, self-taught developers, as well as folks doing on-the-job training programs by employers looking to upskill their developers in specific platforms. And so with so much happening on the informal side, it's really important that companies are supporting that platform. And when Accenture looked at the data and did research with the different developers out there, we saw that nearly 1 in 2 African developers had worked with one of Google's developer training programs. That includes Google Africa Developer Scholarships Program, our developer community programs like Google Developer Groups and Developer Student Clubs, and our programs focused on improving gender equity within the developer ecosystem, which is including women tech makers. But it's great to see that this isn't just one company. This isn't just Google doing this. There's a range of familiar names here on the table. And it's great to see other large tech companies also supporting the growth of the ecosystem. Now, when you look at how developers grow, it was one question we wanted to ask is, what are the challenges for developers who are learning and upskilling? What are the biggest headwinds to their growth? And so we broke it down into 4 categories that you can see here. And interestingly enough, just providing better SDKs or customizing a tool chain, that's not the primary need of developers. The primary need is internet access. It was very clearly called out to us that it needs to be faster, cheaper, and more reliable. Secondly, that there needs to be more education and training opportunities. Developers are asking for this right now. They want more opportunities to step into. And so there really needs to be more opportunities made available. And then finally, business factors, like looking at both on business success side, and then there's also some great feedback here on government support and more ways that government can support developers as they grow. A little bit about just some specific numbers about some of the work we've been doing at Google. So in 2021, we had 40,000 new mobile and cloud developer training scholarships for Africa. And it's great now to look at that 40,000 in context of the bigger number, that 716,000. I think it's, as I said, like what's measured matters. And so being able to put this data in context really helps you to see what's going on. We also announced our $3 million non-dilutive grant funding program, Black Founders Fund Africa, which launched last year and joined our global program of Black Founders Funds. And we've also continued to invest in those long-term programs that we've been supporting for many years now on the continent, including Google for Startups Accelerator Africa, Google Developer Groups, Developer Student Clubs, Women Tech Makers, and we're going to continue to innovate and expand and work on new ways of supporting developers on the continent. Now, the data I've shared with you today It's a report, it's a set of insights, but it's really also a call to action. We need to all be doing more to invest in the developer ecosystem and to understand it. If we're not supporting the pipeline early on, there's not going to be enough senior developers later. And it's been wonderful to see the amount of progress made so far by both on the government level, on small NGOs and nonprofits working across Africa to grow the developer population, volunteer developers and mentors who we've seen working across the region, and government level support for training that we've seen in a variety of areas. But still, a lot more needs to happen. And looking forward to seeing how this takes shape over the years to come. And hopefully this report spurs a talking point and a discussion around what more can be done to support the growth of the developer ecosystem. And so on that note, I want to thank everyone at Google who supported this, everyone at Accenture. The team here have been fantastic at the summit, as well as all of you for taking the time to listen. And I strongly encourage you to take a look and check out the full report. There's the bit.ly link. Also, if you go to @downtempo on Twitter, I've got that pinned to the top of my feed. And take some time, check it out. And if you have any feedback, we'd absolutely love to hear it. Thank you all so much for your time.